Folk wisdom has it that people get more conservative with age. It's said that people start out radical and idealistic, but as they grow older, they become more defensive of the status quo. Now, that idea used to have some basis in observable voting patterns, but if there was an age-based conveyor belt dragging us all ever more to the right, it is now broken down. A recent piece in the FT declared this: millennials are shattering the oldest rule in politics. Western conservatives are at risk from generations of voters who are no longer moving to the right as they age. And that's by John Byrne-Murdoch, the FT's chief data journalist. The piece includes this chart. Each arrow represents a generation and how their voting patterns changed over time. So on the horizontal axis, you have age. On the vertical axis, you have whether at that age, people in that generation were more or less likely to vote Tory than the national average of all ages, of course. Now, as you can see, for the silent generation, so that's people born before 1945, and for boomers and Generation X, they all started out being more left-wing than the national average, but as they aged, they all became more conservative than the average. So they started out when they were young, they were left-wing; when they were old, they were right-wing. For millennials, though, this relationship seems to have broken down, and in fact, millennials seem to be getting more left-wing as they age. So, why aren't millennials getting more right-wing as they get older? Well, Laura Koonsberg asked Rishi Sunak for his ideas.
You are the youngest Prime Minister at 42 in a very long time, but we're in the 13th year of Conservative rule. There's a whole generation that's come of age during that time when rents have gone through the roof, childcare has become extortionate, they're paying more and more tax, owning a house is further and further out of reach. The polls suggest that you're someone very unusual in your early 40s who fancies voting Conservative. Why would anyone under 45 vote Conservative?
Well, I think that the country's priorities are pretty clear, and those are to make sure that we do manage the economy responsibly. That's the thing that's going to make a difference to everybody, whatever age you are. You talked about buying a house. It's going to be harder to buy a house if interest rates are higher. Well, why are interest rates going to be high? It's because inflation is higher. So the best thing we can do to help that generation is to get interest rates down, and that means getting inflation down, which is why the first priority I set out this year was to halve inflation. The second priority I set out was to grow the economy, because I want there to be fantastic jobs in every part of the country for all those young people. You talked about the next generation. We shouldn't burden them with debts. That's why it's important that we reduce borrowing a debt. That's the third promise I made. And then the last two are important to them too, when it's about cutting waiting lists and stopping the boats. I think everyone cares about those. Everyone has a family member that at any point in time is reliant on the NHS, whether it's a grandparent who needs a hip operation, whether it's someone who's had to be rushed to emergency care, or someone who just needs to see the GP for their kid's ear infection. So having a really well-performing NHS is important to everybody. And stopping the boats is about fairness. And I think that is a value that everyone in this country believes in, regardless of what age you are. And having a system which is seen as unfair because people are abusing it isn't the right thing. It's not the right long-term thing for this country. And that's why those are the right priorities.
Why should young people vote Conservative? Oh, because young people also have an interest in a decent NHS. That's a reason not to vote Conservative, Rishi Sunak. I also like the idea you're going to win back the under 45s by stopping small boats crossing the channel. We don't care. Aaron, what do you make, I suppose, both of this data point about millennials not becoming more right-wing, and then, there's hardly anything to comment on in Rishi Sunak's kind of non-answer there. But let's start with the phenomenon, let's say.
I think there is, but let's start with the phenomenon. I would start by saying, actually, Michael, I take umbrage with this idea that it's the oldest rule in politics. I don't think that's necessarily true. It's definitely something which has defined 20th century politics. But the idea that you become more conservative with age, historically, most people just didn't live that long. If you look at, for instance, the word Senate in Rome, it comes from senex, which means older man. In ancient Sparta, you had the gerousia. That's where we get the word geriatric from. It was ruled by the elderly because they were wise. So this idea that you became more right-wing or more left-wing, it just wasn't a thing. You became more wise and more risk-averse, I presume you could say, as you became older. But the idea that you map a right-wing, right-left-wing split onto age, very contemporary phenomenon. Clearly, over the course of the 20th century, that is a fair thing to say. It's particularly after the Second World War. Millennials aren't pursuing that path, I think, for a bunch of reasons, which I'm sure, our audience are more familiar with that than anyone else. That age cohort came of age. I graduated the year 2007 when the global financial crisis kicked off, Michael. So I entered the labour market, which over the preceding 15 years didn't offer real rising wages, kept me off the housing ladder. I had significant student debt, which has also only got worse for people ever since. You know, Rishi Sunak was asked about high taxes for millennials. Student debt is a really big tax, which we don't talk about. You know, I don't recall Laura Kuenssberg even saying student debt and debt repayments, because they are a form of tax. You know, basically, if you look at the marginal rate of tax that middle income earners who are millennials pay, it's higher than higher income earners who are that bit older, who don't have student debt. So I think the material explanations are quite straightforward. You can't afford to buy a house, you can barely afford to rent, or you're being traumatized by having to move every other year. You can't afford to start a family. You certainly can't afford to save for old age, let alone look after your parents if they need you. So these are all the basics of a good life: housing, family, progress, a sense of tomorrow being better than today and today being better than yesterday. That's evaporated over the last 15 years because really we've been in a moment of national decline. We've had one lost decade. We're halfway through the second one. I think we could even have a third one. It's an awful way for people to experience their lives, and that has triggered a sense of political activation amongst many people under 45, not everyone. And of course, there are older people as well who are very left-wing and agree with everything I just said. But those people say, well, you know what, I only get one shot at life, and I don't want to rent forever. And I don't want to be living in a miserable experience. And I want a sense of community. And if I do rent, I want to be in a place where I know people and I don't have to move every 6 months. And I want a job which is fulfilling. I don't want outsourcing in the NHS. I want an effective service. So there's a reason why this age cohort has given up on capitalism, or neoliberalism more specifically, and that's because neoliberalism has given up on them. The specifics of what Rishi Sunak said, I thought were actually quite revealing, Michael. So he said about how younger people, millennials, Gen Z, need a responsibly managed economy because that's in their rational interest. Well, the Tories have been in charge for the last 13 years, and that's when millennials have become more left-wing. And one reason why is because you haven't responsibly managed the economy. There haven't been real rising wages. You haven't been able to get on the housing ladder if you work hard. There's been a dysfunction within the internal logics of the conservative worldview. Then secondly, he says if you want low inflation, which is an outgrowth of economic management, then you need to vote Tory. Well, inflation's presently 10%, and we've got Tories running the country. So there was so much internal incoherence within his own argument. I think that really makes the case for why the Conservatives should no longer be in power, Michael. You know, Rishi Sunak unconsciously laid out a series of statements as to why he himself should not be the Prime Minister. What a world we're living in.